All right, fabulous team macro. I apologize for the lateness of this post. My previous lecture on ASAD somehow has vanished. I couldn't find it. So I'm re-recording a brief lecture. I'll keep it pretty short. The reason being is that this chapter, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, is very, very similar to your chapter 3. So I would invite you to go back and review your notes, review your material, review chapter 3 for the fundamentals of supply and demand analysis. Those are still going to apply, especially in the sense that, increases of the curves are to the right, decreases are to the left. We start with a model in equilibrium, assume equilibrium unless you're told otherwise. And then an event happens and you'll shift one of the curves, find that new equilibrium, and then show with all those directional arrows. Go back and review the mechanics, right? I'm not going to reteach supply and demand. We already did that. You spent the time. A lot of you spent a lot of time in chapter 3 learning that. So you may have to go back and relearn, just brush up a little bit, but that's okay. Those mechanics, and then always report your results. Now, when we're looking at this model, and we're talking about P and Q, we're obviously not talking about a single price or a single quantity. The P is going to represent our price level. So that's the CPI. The reason being, it doesn't make sense to add the price of cereal to the price of a car. Those are two vastly different numbers. It has no meaning whatsoever. So we use the price level. When the P goes up, that's an increase in the price level, the CPI, that's inflation. When the P goes down, that's deflation, okay? Q is GDP. So think of that as units of production, not necessarily, again, the value of the car or the cereal, but units. So it's a measure of how much stuff did we make. If Q goes up, we made more stuff. Q goes down, we made less stuff. Simple as that. All right, let me get to my lecture notes, and I'm just going to walk through my lecture notes and add a little bit more detail as we go along with this lesson. And just a heads up that your next exam, your second exam, is coming next weekend, not this weekend, obviously. So next week you will have your practice exam due, and I'll post the answers, and then you will have the weekend to do both parts of the second exam, the multiple choice portion and the take-home portion, very similar to the first exam, okay? So just a heads up, if you need to tell your boss you need next weekend off or not go on that trip, make sure that you allow yourselves enough time to get both parts of that exam done. All right, so let me open up, without any further ado, the lecture notes. Oh, I need to share my screen. Hold on. I've got them on my screen, but you probably can't see them. So hold on. Share. All right, so hopefully this is sharing for you guys. You can see these are my lecture notes. Let's just walk through this a little bit here. And so the aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Let's start with that AD curve. This is who is buying our GDP. And so much like regular supply and demand, a good chunk of that aggregate demand is being made up by our households, by our consumers. And so you can see in the formula for calculating GDP, to get GDP, and we did this back in the GDP section, we do, and here highlighted for you, aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. We're summing up the expenditures from the 4 sectors. The consumer sector is the household sector, and that's what we households buy for our own personal consumption throughout the course of the year. All the stuff that we buy and then consume, okay? Consumption actually makes up 2/3 of GDP on average, about 67%. So that's a lot. We are the most important sector of the economy and of that aggregate demand model. So major things other than income that are going to affect us will shift that aggregate demand curve, and big picture things. So when we're talking about demand, aggregate demand, we're not talking about prices of related goods because all the goods are in GDP. And so if we move consumption from one good to another good, it's just a transfer, GDP stays the same. So we don't look at prices of related goods. We don't look at normal versus inferior, stuff like that, okay, when we're talking aggregate demand. But we do look at a couple big things that affect consumption, and one is wealth. Now remember, economists define words very specifically, very carefully. Remember, wages is a supply shifter. Income is regular demand shifter, not aggregate demand. Income only shifts demand in a simple supply and demand model. Wealth is different from income. Income is your earned income in the labor market. Wealth is your portfolio. Wealth is your stock markets. Wealth is a lottery, winning the lottery, getting an inheritance from your grandmother. That is your wealth. Okay. Big things that we say are unearned, okay. In terms of it didn't take your labor resources, it used, some other mechanism to get you that increase in wealth that will shift the aggregate demand curve. And so this is one way that the stock market can affect aggregate demand. If the stock market starts going crazy, like that GameStop shenanigans that went on, really interesting event that happened a couple weeks ago, where some amateur investors outplayed the professional investors. Super cool for us economists to watch it all go down. But anyways, in those cases, if stock market, I saw like a 12-year-old kid had made like $10,000 or something on his, a couple shares of GameStop that he'd gotten for Christmas or something. But anyways, and so that wealth that he got, that would in fact make him buy more stuff that year, right? And so that would in fact shift his aggregate, not his, but the economy's aggregate demand curve. So when the stock market is doing excessively well, and not just a normal well, because normal well is built into the system, right? So we're talking this wealth when you actually, so the value of your stock sitting in your portfolio that you don't touch, that's not going to affect aggregate demand. What is going to affect aggregate is big jumps that you capitalize on, that you take the earnings from, okay, that then you go and spend. So that's the difference there, okay? So don't just think the stock market on its normal trajectory upward is always affecting GDP. No, but big jumps or big losses, as we saw in 1929 with the crash, right? Anyways, and in 2010 or 2008, 2010 with that recession, we did have some financial markets that tumbled and had some significant declines, and that decreased wealth, decreased our aggregate demand, threw us into a recession that was already starting and made it really bad, part of that Great Recession, okay? Anyway, so wealth will affect the C part of this equation, will shift aggregate demand. Increases in wealth to the right, decreases in wealth to the left. Another factor that consumers consider when they are deciding how much money to spend on GDP over the course of a year, they look at the interest rate. Now, the interest rate is important. It helps us finance big purchases like a house, like a car, like a new boat, those kinds of things. Or it can affect your ability to borrow to go to college. It can also affect your credit cards, your ability to put stuff on your credit cards. So if the interest rate goes up, that is bad for GDP, okay? Interest rate going up, that's gonna make people put off buying their house, not buy a new car, not buy big things, invest in that big engagement ring you were thinking of getting your fiance, and so on, okay? So interest rate goes up, aggregate demand shifts left. Interest rate falls, consumers start going crazy, and that aggregate demand curve will go to the right, okay? I have that illustrated right here. Give me a second if I can find where I can scroll. And you can see in my aggregate supply aggregate demand model here, always start out, the model looks exactly the same as regular supply, regular demand. Price is always on the vertical, quantity is always on the horizontal. You start out with your original center of the X, the two black lines labeled as P1 and Q1. Always identify your original equilibrium, right? Then an event happens, in this case, increase in wealth. So we got some inheritance money. Somehow the stock market went crazy and we took out our gains from our stock market and now we're going to spend them. And so that is a rightward shift. Notice my arrow goes to the right. It does not go up or down. That's a rightward shift. Make sure your directional arrows are all going the right way. rightward shift in aggregate demand, find the new equilibrium up here at P2 and Q2. Make sure to label those, both P2 and Q2, and then use these nice directional arrows to show that both price and quantity went up. Report your results. Simple aggregate supply, aggregate demand analysis to analyze the effect of one event, in this case, increase in wealth. Okay, over here, what I just talked about with the interest rates, on the other hand, if interest rates go up, that's going to be a leftward shift. Notice this blue arrow, a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve, and that's going to cause prices to fall and quantity to fall as well. Again, noting your report your results down here. All right, so that was consumption. Those are the factors that will affect the aggregate demand curve just through the use of consumption. Consumption, 67% of GDP. So that means the I, the G, the X minus M is all going to be 33% of our GDP. Smaller, significantly smaller portion of GDP. Investment is purchases by firms in big capital things that they're going to use for future production. So they invest in a new factory. They go out and buy some new bulldozers. They go out and buy some new computers, okay? That kind of investment where they're going to use that to turn around and make more stuff next year. Those kinds of purchases of what are considered final goods and services, right? The Dell gets all that money from the computers that they buy, right? And it's not an intermediate good because the company, let's say H&R Block, buys a bunch of computers, right? They're not selling the computers. It's not an intermediate good because they don't turn around, put the computer on a package and sell the computer. They're using the computer to produce tax returns. So that's different. So in that case, the computers are not an intermediate good like windshield wipers put on a car are intermediate goods because the consumer gets the windshield wiper as part of their car. Okay, that's different than capital purchases, investment that the firms engage in to produce more stuff next year. Okay, so those purchases, that's called investment. Government is the next sector. And let me just quickly, before I scroll through the rest of this handout, just let me talk about government, this G sector. So, you know, added to the firms and added to the rest of the world, that's what X minus IM is, the rest of the world, exports and imports, right? That's only 33%. So government makes up an even smaller, less than 33%. And it varies how big G is depending on the administration that is in the power in the executive and legislative branches of the federal government. Executive being the president, legislative being Congress, the House and the Senate, right? And it's combined because it takes all three to get policies passed and implemented, big policy changes and things like that, right? So that's how our federal government works, right? So depending on the composition of those three bodies, let's say the White House, the Senate and the House, right? In terms of that, if they tend to be more democratic, they tend to favor bigger government, right? So it can go up from 18, 20, 22 to 25% of our economy at some point, right? On the other hand, if it tends to be more Republican, it tends to come down 23, 22, 18, 16. Okay. Republicans want smaller government, right? But think about that G. Okay. At most, we're talking 1/4 of our economy, 25%, right? Because people like to throw around the word socialism. And they like to think that if we start increasing that G, let's say, heaven forbid, we go 25, 27, 29, 30, they think that's socialism. Yeah, I got news for you. Socialism is over 50% government control, right? Okay, so that's socialism. Sweden at 77%, they're socialist and they're very highly successful. So when you're dissing on socialism, don't, because Sweden can do it. There are forms of socialism that haven't worked. Just like there's capitalist countries that have succeeded, there's capitalist countries that have failed. So don't do the, oh, all socialist countries fail, all socialist countries succeed. No, there's examples all across the board. That's stupid. Don't do it, okay? Now, so don't say everybody's like Sweden. Don't say everybody's like Cuba, right? Well, actually, Cuba is a dictatorship. They're command and control. Anyways, some poor socialist country, okay? Socialist countries can do very, very well. But think about it. If we took our entire federal budget and doubled it. It's huge. It's huge already. Let's say we're at 24%, and we doubled it, right? We doubled the amount we spend on roads. We doubled the amount of our military, which is already I don't understand how huge it is, right? Kind of why we need a military that huge nowadays. We don't, okay? We doubled our national parks. We doubled everything that the federal government, doubled it. We'd only be 48%. We wouldn't even be socialist. Can you imagine? So we're not even close. We'd have to triple, quadruple our GDP. Okay, triple to be socialist. Okay, up where Sweden is, as an example. So this idea that spending a little more money so that people can have health care, that's not going to make us socialist. Not even close. We might go from 25 to 28, and a lot of people would have health care. Maybe that's kind of worth it. You have to think, okay? So don't be scared by a lot of the rhetoric out there. Let's look at the hard data. Let's understand the facts as it comes. And again, I just use healthcare as an example, right? Republicans will say, hey, no, let's spend more on our military. Okay, if that's what you value, you want to spend more on the military, we can do it without becoming socialist. Okay, we've got a lot of wiggle room before we even become socialist. Canada, they're only at like 33 or 35% in terms of, you think of Canada as being the socialist nation. No. Even China, which used to be former command and control, former communist country, is now a capitalist country. They're not socialists. Okay, they are part of us. They're capitalists. So don't be scared by this idea that we spend a little more money on government and we automatically turn into the socialist nation. We are so far from that, right, as an economy, okay? So I wish people would stop using that word socialism as a bad word and start thinking about, do you support individual programs that the government is talking about? Do you support eliminating student loan debt? Do you support providing college for free? Do you support universal health care? Those kinds of things, okay? Those are the issues that we can and should be thinking about and asking, is this a good thing? By doing those things, I think we can do all of those things and still not be anywhere close to socialist, right? But it would require all of us buying in, okay? This is my spiel on government and the economy. Another thing to consider in light of the events that occurred this week down in Texas, right? We saw that a snowstorm, a whopping snowstorm by northern standards, 6 inches. We got that the other night, right? We got that the other night and my road was plowed like 3 hours after that, right? Kind of idea. The snow plows were out there working because we have the equipment, because northern states governments have invested in snowplows, right? See how that government spending is hard at work, clearing our roads for us so that we can get to school, we can get to work, we can get to the grocery store. Texas doesn't have that. They've never needed it. So Texas has not invested in any infrastructure for a cold snap like they're getting right now, for even 6 inches of roads, shut down their major highways. People couldn't get to work, couldn't get to the grocery stores. Huge panic. It overworked the electrical grid because everybody turned on their heat on high, right, to try and deal with all of this. So clearly, Texas was not prepared. The federal government, their state government, the state government of Texas, and the local governments, whose responsibility it might be to have the snowplows, right, had not invested, had not spent enough G to make it, so to prevent this really, really bad disaster. If you're paying attention, it's tragic. People are dying, right, down there. 23 people, I think, have died already. Really sad, really tragic. Lack of preparedness for a winter storm, which us Northerners are like, we do this all the time. But of course, we've got mittens, we've got snow plows, snow pants, we've got snow brushes in our car, right? We've got the snow plows, snow shovels, salt. We have all the equipment that we need, okay, and all the preparation, and Texas didn't. And so that's a case where Texas might need to look at, hey, we need to invest more state monies into a better electrical grid system, right? Into improving our antiquated electricity system and being able to provide, when there's a big surge in demand, right? Being able to quickly move energy to where it is needed kind of idea. And so in their case, they would need to up G. Okay. And so that's what we're talking about, government expenditures for all of us that we all enjoy. And we can argue amongst ourselves which policies we support, which ones we don't. But I think we all have to agree that at some level, government expenditures are important. And also the caveat that tweaking them a little bit, right? Adding universal health care may add 2-3% to GDP. We're not talking going from 25 to 77 overnight. It ain't going to happen. Okay. For China, they went from 100 down to 48. It took them over 35 years to get from 100 down to 48. So what do you think? How long does it take us to go? That was 50%, right? So for us to go from 25 to 75, where Sweden is, another 35 years, right? Kind of idea. No, we're not going to get there. Nobody would let it get that far. Okay. We're not Sweden. We're the United States. However, sometimes we need to consider some G. Okay. All right. So that's my spiel on government spending. So increases in government spending, going out and buying more snowplows, going out and investing in education, going out and spending a lot of money on COVID vaccines so that everybody can have them, like the federal government is doing right now. They are buying up all the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines and sending them to the states. So the states are not paying for the vaccines themselves. The states might be incurring costs in the distribution. They might have to rent out the Spokane Arena, for example, to do the distribution of those vaccines, but the vaccines were paid for by the federal government. Okay, so that's G, right? Good old G coming to save our asses. Okay, all right. Anyways, scroll down. So as I was talking about government spending, when G goes up, aggregate demand shifts right. G goes down, aggregate demand shifts left. Well, in some cases, the government chooses to fund G through taxes. So, hey, y'all, you know, in Texas, y'all, notice how I said that, down in Texas, hey, y'all, we need to buy a couple snowplows so this doesn't happen next time, right? We're all going to chip in, okay? And they raise taxes to buy the snowplows, okay? In that case, an increase in taxes is actually going to shift the aggregate demand curve back to the left, because if we're taking money out of the consumer's pockets, right, they can't buy as much. So increase in taxes, aggregate demand goes left. A decrease in taxes, if you want people to spend more money, if we need to stimulate the economy, right? Decrease in taxes will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, okay? And so that's why in some cases, if government needs to spend, like with the COVID vaccines, we're not raising taxes for that. We are funding that through the national debt. We're putting it on the credit card, and then we'll figure out how to pay for it later. Okay, so don't worry about that, because right now, where a lot of people are still struggling and not working full time and having difficulty making expenses work, right? Especially as we're a little bit recessionary, raising taxes to pay for the COVID vaccines would not make sense. So we're just going to put it on the government on credit card. When things get better, then we'll raise the taxes and pay that off. Okay, we can pay the credit card off later. That's called the national debt. And that's what we're doing. We're debt financing for those huge expenditures that I think you all agree we need, those COVID vaccines. Okay. All right. So here we go. You can see then I'm showing the effect of government on the ASAD model here. Hold on one second. I am getting thirsty. All right. So an increase in G on the left-hand side here, shifts that aggregate demand curve to the right, find that new equilibrium, P and Q, notice results, that pulls up prices. That means we're gonna have a little bit of inflation. And this is called demand pull inflation, because it's actually good inflation in the sense that the prices are rising because demand is going up and we're selling more stuff. So that's a good thing. Demand pull inflation is not as problematic as stagflation, which we're going to see in just a couple minutes, okay? So we have growth. We're going to have to accommodate it with a little bit of inflation. And the rule of thumb is, as long as the rate of inflation stays at or below the rate of growth, the GDP growth rate, everything will be fine. So if we're growing at a rate of 3.5%, which would be phenomenal, you know, students always think 3.5%, that's so small. No, that's a fantastic growth rate, okay? If our economy grows at 3.5%, and that's actually like our target, the best we want to do, and prices come in at 3% inflation, we're good. We covered it, okay? That's normal. It's normal that prices would go up during a period of growth or expansion in the economy. Over here on the right is, like I was saying, if we, on the other hand, raise taxes and take money out of people's pockets, that's going to shift that aggregate demand curve to the left and have the effect of lowering prices and lowering output. So that's my spiel on G. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about G and T when we get to fiscal policy in the last part of the class. Okay, so more is coming, but in terms of the ASAD model, increases in government and decreases in taxes will both shift aggregate demand to the right, and increase in taxes, decrease in government spending will shift that aggregate demand curve to the left. Okay. The rest of the world, the major thing to think about is how does the rest of the world affect our economy? One of the ways is through our exchange rate. And when we call the exchange rate, we call that the value of the dollar relative to other currencies. We do not say the value of a US dollar. That doesn't make sense. So when you hear somebody talking about inflation, and I may have said this in my inflation lecture already, but just to remind you, right, that, oh, you're old people, right? The grandpas and your parents will say, oh, value of the dollar just ain't worth what it used to be. No, grandpa, the value of $1 bill is still $1. The value of a $10 bill, it's written right there on the bill, still says $10. If you take a $10 bill from 1950 and you hand it to the cashier at Yokes, they don't go, oh, it's a 1950 $10 bill. It's only worth $6. No, the value of the $10 bill is still $10. So the value of the US dollar does not decline over time. The purchasing power of the $10 bill, however, does change due to the effects of inflation, right? So the $10 bill doesn't go as far in 2021 as it did in 1970, for example, right? That's purchasing power. That's not value of the dollar. So the correct way, and please go out and correct all your friends and family relatives, look like a total nerd, but a very, very smart nerd that you all are, and especially correct the people on the news. I'm always going, oh God, these news people need some economics classes. So please, if any of you are considering going to work for the news, please pay attention, okay? The correct way to talk about the value of the dollar is relative to other currencies. We can say, okay, well, the dollar advanced against the Canadian dollar or the Mexican peso or the yen or the euro, okay? And when we say that, what we're saying is the US dollar gets stronger if the exchange rate goes in our favor. More people want the dollar than they want the other currency, okay? That sounds like a good thing. Strong dollar, go USA, yay. Wrong answer. That is bad for GDP. Strong dollar is great if you are planning a vacation and you're going to Paris and you want to buy, or you're going to Europe and you want to spend your money all over Italy, France, Germany, Spain, England. If you want to go spend your money overseas, a strong dollar is good for their GDP. If you want to go help the European GDP, take your strong dollar over there. That's where it's a good thing for an American. It's bad for our GDP because now our goods and services look very, very expensive to the Europeans. And they're not going to want to travel here and they're not going to want to buy our goods and services. Strong dollar, bad for economy, okay? Counterintuitive. So hopefully you're paying attention all this way into the lecture, okay? So when we have a strong dollar, aggregate demand shifts left just like it does in this picture here, okay? The reason is, as the US dollar gets stronger, we spend more overseas on imports and people spend less. The rest of the world spends less on our stuff. So our exports fall, our imports rise. Both of that's going to shift aggregate demand to the left, and P is going to fall, Q is going to fall. Let's move on to aggregate supply really quickly. Aggregate supply, super duper easy. It's the same as regular supply. That's why I left it till the end. Yay! Aggregate supply. Things that shift aggregate supply is anything that affects our firms, big things that affect our firms, not something that's going to affect the manufacture of chocolate, right? But big picture things all across the economy, going to make our economy, our firms, be able to produce the goods more or less efficiently. Okay, so inputs, cost of inputs, cost of oil for transportation, right? Wages, other but computer costs, infrastructure costs, building materials, okay? Those things are going to affect our firms. Big picture. Technology obviously will increase aggregate supply, and then productivity, increase aggregate supply. Productivity can go the other way if we're also distracted because we're on our phones all the time and we're not getting work done. Productivity could go leftward. Okay, so be careful with that one. Acts of nature, hurricanes, huge snowstorms in Texas, right? Those kinds of things will shift aggregate supply to the left. Okay, so pretty similar to the supply shifters from chapter 3. Go back and revisit those. And so you can see, again, we use the word wages as distinct from income and wealth. 3 different concepts. Make sure you know the difference between wages, income, and wealth. Okay. Wages, increase in wages, that's going to decrease the aggregate supply. A leftward shift. Notice my directional arrow is left. It is not up. Okay. And that's going to pull up prices and decrease quantity. Increase in wages here is actually causing stagflation. Stagflation is stagnation in the economy. Q is falling along with inflation. Prices are rising. Look at this. P up, Q down. Double whammy. Okay. Not only are we producing less, but what we are producing is costing us more. People are unemployed. When they go to buy milk, the price of milk has gone up. Double whammy. Okay, stagflation is very bad for the economy. So that type of inflation, very unhealthy. We don't like it. On the other hand, over here, increases in technology will increase that aggregate supply curve. All right, so there you go. Now you have the gist of it. Very much like regular supply and demand, you'll start in equilibrium, something will kick us out. You'll find the new equilibrium, shift the right curve, find the new equilibrium compared to the old, and so on. So hopefully you have enough tools now that you can go and do the exercise and get the practice and work hard and get ready for that next exam. Okay, so there won't be a personal lecture next week because you'll just be prepping for that exam. All right, if you have any questions, as always, don't forget to reach out. I am on the road this weekend. My little guy has a hockey tournament, but my hotel will have Wi-Fi and I will be checking my emails regularly. So if you do have questions, by all means, reach out. Just maybe it might be a little delayed till you get a response. So don't wait till the last minute is my caution, right, on that. All right, so have a good weekend. Stay safe and healthy, everybody, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and let you guys all go.